Okay, so now that we got this protection code here in place, in the next step we know that this request is coming from an authenticated user, and we know that it's a request with the right method. So now we need to extract data from the incoming request, the old and the new password, and we will also need the email address of that user. Because of course in the database we store users with emails and passwords, and if we want to change the password of a user, we need that email address of the user as well to identify that user. Thankfully, getting that email address is not too difficult, even though it's not part of this form here, because we do encode the email address in our token. We return that object here in our next of file, and that data ends up in the token, and therefore it's part of that session which we get here. So we can get the user email by accessing session.user.email here. And we can then also get the other data, like the old password, by reaching out to the request, and there the body field as we learned it. So that's what we also do in the signup.js file when we create a user. There we also get the email and password by diving into the request body in the end. And here in change password, we could, for example, expect that on the body we got a old password field, and then we got the new password, which we get from request body.new password. Of course, we'll have to make sure that when we send a request from the client to the server later, that we have old and new password, that we have these two fields in the request data, which we attach to the outgoing request. And with that, we got all the data we need. Now we want to connect to the database and find a user by that email. And then once we got that user, we want to check if the old password is correct. So if it matches the password currently stored in the database. And if that's then the case, we want to hash the new password and replace the old password with the new one. And for this, of course, we can call connect to database again and import that from our libdb file like this. And then here call connect to database and await this, of course. And here we then get the client. And then once we got the client, we can reach out to the database and then there to the collection that stores our users, which is the users collection here. So here we then reach out to the users collection. Users collection, I can store access to that collection in a separate constant. And then we can use that users collection to find one user by email, as we did it before as well in the authentication code. There we also find a user by email. And now we're going to do the same thing here. We look for the email field in our documents and check if we find one document where the email address stored in the document is equal to the user email we get from the session. Now this will return a promise, so we await that, and then we'll get a user document, or not. But if we somehow don't find a user, something is wrong anyways, because that user email is coming from the session. So it would be strange if we have a logged in user and yet he or she is missing from the database. But still, we can also handle that case, close our connection here, and then possibly also return some error. This could be a 404 error where we say user not found or something like this. Now, if we make it past this check, which we typically should, we can now verify the password. So we get the current password by accessing user.password. So this user document, which we get from the database, and there the password field, which is this hashed password. That's the current password now. And now we want to verify this. And for that, in the lib folder, we have this auth.js file with the verify password function. And I want to call this function now. And hence we need to import verify password from libauth. We need to add this import. And with it imported, we can call verify password and pass in the incoming password, so the old password in our case, as a first argument, and then the stored hashed password to which we want to compare it, so this current password here, as a second argument. And we then await this because that returns a promise, and we get back the answer to the question whether the passwords are equal or not. And if they are not equal, if not passwords are equal, if that is false, then we know that the old password entered here simply does not match the user's password. And in this case, we don't want to allow the user to change the password, of course. So here we want to return, we want to also close our client connection, and we want to send back a response where the status code could be 403, not 401 as it was before, but 403, where we say you are authenticated. That's why it's not 401, but you're not authorized for this operation. You simply do not have the permissions to perform this operation, even though you're authenticated. And in this case, the user doesn't have the permissions for this specific operation because the passwords are not equal. Of course, alternatively, we could also use 422, which kind of indicates that the user input is incorrect. And that would be a fair assumption here as well, that the user simply mistyped the old password. Ultimately, it's up to you which status code you want to use, because after all, it will also be you who has to handle these status codes in the front-end code when it comes to showing an error message to the users. So here I'll go for 403 and then also attach some data with a message key where I say invalid password or something like this. Now, if we do make it past this if check though, then we know that the passwords are equal, and then we can replace the old password in the database with the new one. Now, for this, we can use our users collection again and call update1 to update1 document. And for that, we now need to pass in a first argument where we identify the document that should be updated. And in this case, that's the document where the email matches the user email. So the same filter as we set it up here for finding a user. But then here we also need to pass in a second argument where we describe the update. Now for describing the update, we also pass in a JavaScript object as a second argument. And in there we add the special $set key. This is a special key which will be identified and understood by MongoDB. And $set then wants a nested object as a value where we just set the properties of the document that should change. So in this case, for example, I don't want to change the email, I don't want to change the ID, I want to change the password. So as a value for $set, I have an object where I set password. And now this key here has to match one of the keys of your document, or it's added as a new key if it doesn't, which I don't want here. So here I'll set password to the new password. But of course, as you learned, not like this. Instead, we want to hash that new password first, because if the password is changed, we of course still don't want to store plain text passwords in the database. And therefore here, I'll now create my hashed password by calling hash password, which is a function we have to import from the libof file as well. And when we call hash password, we pass the new password, the plain text password, as an argument, and then await this operation since it returns a promise. And we then get this hashed password, and that's then the password we want to set for the update1 operation. And this will now update the user in the database. Now we can also await this operation, and we can get the result and do something with it if we want to. Here I don't actually need it, but still I'll get it. And we can also add error handling as we did it before in the course. But for the moment I'll ignore all of that. I'll then just close the client connection and then send back a response with a status code of 200 where we, for example, say password updated. Like this. And now with all that in place, with all that code added, we should have the code that does change the password of an authenticated user. And therefore, now with that all in place, we now need to go to the front end and work on the front end code to send a HTTP request to this newly added API route.